So, hi everybody. This is Aruna Gopakumar, and I'm here with my colleague and mentor Surya. And today we're going to talk about the very interesting idea of Physis. I think this idea of this talk came about because I wanted to learn about Physis, and I have seen Surya running workshops on Physis for several years, day-long workshops, and I have been very intrigued. And I said, if I have to learn about Physis from one person, it has to be Surya. And Surya, as expected, was immediately generous, no questions asked. Sure, when, how? I said, if we just record what you teach me, shall we put it up on YouTube for the whole TA community and for anyone who's interested in the idea of Physis? Said, okay, why not? And hopefully this is the start of a series of talks like this that we do within us as colleagues in TA, and then these are available for the curious, yeah, to learn from. So thank you, Surya. Thank you for your generosity and thank you for making the time.
My pleasure, Na. And thank you for asking me.
Yeah.
Yes, it also helps me to, in a way, bring together my thoughts and gather my thoughts together on this subject, Physis, which is very close to my heart. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I also find participants come alive, even though I teach Physis so briefly. And I always use this metaphor that if you put a plant in the dark, it will find its way to the sun. And that somehow fills them with the idea of hope that despite all their challenges, they are where they are. And there is some positive force that has brought them where they are. And to connect with that positive force is always energizing.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So, shall we just dive into it? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
So, maybe we start by you telling us what Physis is. What is this idea of Physis?
Okay. So I think before getting into what is Physis, maybe
Yeah.
talk about how is it relevant, this whole thing of Physis, that is why Physis. I think that
Yeah.
would be much more helpful. Because Physis is fundamentally the inner force, life force that all of us have.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So in a very, very normal sense, that is what it is.
Mm.
I'll talk more about it after saying, why Physis.
Sure. Sure.
As transactional analysts, we have seen, originally it was developed as a psychotherapeutic framework in the 50s, 60s, and so on. So therefore, the emphasis at that time was more on studying psychopathology in terms of looking at, what is making people not function to their capacity or fullest potential or whatever it is. And much of its application is to look at how to remove pathology. So that is how it's been. Most of the early psychotherapeutic approaches have been working on that aspect.
Yeah.
For example, me being an organizational transaction analyst,
Yeah.
it's more to do with to look at, since we're working mostly with people who are for most part of their lives functional.
Yeah.
The changes that are expected is also more to do with how do I function better.
Mm.
So that is where what the emphasis is more on health in that sense.
Mm.
So if I were to just share my screen,
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
like to just a second. Talk a bit about that before we move into talking about Physis in details. As you could see, the WHO defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease of it or infirmity. Okay, so health is not just absence of something negative, but it is something more than positive. Okay, so we are aware in the organizational theory of motivation, the two-factor theory, we talk about absence of dissatisfaction doesn't mean satisfaction.
Correct.
Most
Yeah.
of the time there is a state of no satisfaction.
Yeah.
So therefore, when you expand that to say psychotherapy or any other field where we work in mental health, removing or absence of pathology is not health.
Yeah, if you're not languishing, it doesn't mean you're thriving.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Yeah.
therefore, there's a whole lot of frameworks that help us to work with removing pathology.
Yeah.
The question is, what do we do in order to help people thrive?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that is where there is a need for something that focus on health.
Mm,
And that is where the idea of Physis comes into
mm, mm.
So unfortunately, Eric Berne also did not write much about Physis.
Yeah. Yeah.
You look about it. I think he has written just a couple of pages about Physis per se.
Like many of his ideas.
Yeah.
He sown the seed and left it for
Yeah,
somebody else to pick it up. Yeah.
exactly. So therefore there is a need for us to, really expand on that, because that will help us to develop a whole set of framework and approaches that could focus on health part of mental health, which can be expanded into the other fields in terms of looking at things from more from a developmental perspective rather than from a pathological perspective, and so on and so forth. So that is where Physis comes, becomes relevant, and that is where I got interested in studying about Physis. So what is Physis?
Yeah.
That's a question that you asked. So let us get to that. I would also like to share this screen to talk about what is Physis. The word Physis is not originated from TA literature. That is something all of us need to acknowledge. It is a very age-old term, having its origin in Greek theology.
Yeah.
Both it is used in a philosophical and also in their own, at those times, what was considered as a scientific term. Very loosely translated to, it becomes what is called nature.
Yeah.
So that is, in other words, a Physis is any entity's nature. Like as you said, the moment you put a seed into the soil, wherever it is, even though it is deep in the soil, it will somehow find its way to come up above the surface.
Yeah.
Right? Similarly, if you put a plant in a shade, it will somehow find its way up to sunlight.
Yeah.
So that, because it's its nature. It's not, whether you do something or even if you leave it without doing anything, it would somehow get to that space.
Yeah.
Of course, it needs those nurturing environment conditions and so on. Okay. So later,
Innate
yeah,
ability to grow and
yes,
fulfill what it is meant for.
yes, absolutely. It is that force, life force in each living entity, which really drives it towards, if you had to use the word, to realize its full potential. Whatever it is. So there are several other later authors who talked about Physis in their own way, like, Gurier talked about it as a change or growth which comes from the spirit within the person. Okay, it is growth, which again, towards a better space, or most of the time it is used as that to mean the essence of life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nobody can define it, but we all feel it, we all sense it. So that is the most enamoring part about Physis, at least for me. And this is what Burns said: it's a force of nature which eternally strives to make things grow and to make going things more perfect. It was really very provocative way when we don't even say there is nothing which is perfect, but he says it makes things more perfect,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
fundamentally means how can I be better? How can I be better? That is the innate force. And
Yeah.
that is why, as he said, even if you give it sense of it, immediately people get so energized and so on, because we don't come across very many frameworks or spaces where this emphasis on growth and nature and the fundamental essence is emphasized.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's
So,
so
yeah,
immediately relatable, isn't it?
yes,
Like,
yes.
like when will I stop learning? Yeah, because I was in a psychodrama workshop and one person was, I think, 83 years old attending the workshop. And she said, I think I learn the most when I'm on my deathbed. It's this constant urge to become better, isn't it? It's
Exactly.
so energizing. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, in expecting anything sort of.
Yeah.
It's just the sheer joy of learning and growing and developing. I think that is where Physis, becomes so relevant. So as a verb, it means to grow, to be. I think what is more resonating with me is the definition of just to be, and that is Physis.
Yeah.
Be here means, not just being passive, but more in terms of, being in my full self. So whatever I am and what things really are. That's what, Edwards says. What things really are. And that to me actually struck. That is the closest, if I look at it from our Indian philosophy, it is the closest to that is the idea of dharma.
Mm.
I know many people don't see it that way because the idea of dharma itself is often not, clearly understood for many of us.
Yeah.
We talk of dharma more in terms of, what would I say, ethics or
What's my
code.
role? And it's more than ethics.
Yeah,
It's
you talk about it in terms of right and wrong and,
my
and
purpose and all of that.
purpose, meaning. But actually, the fundamental essence of what dharma means is, I think the Mahabharata Bhishma says, that which sustains is dharma.
Mm. Mm.
So therefore, in other words, it is the beingness of any being is called dharma. It's dharma. In other words, our full potential. That's why, what things really are. So, and that is what Physis is. What drives me to be who I am. So that is Physis. So, so that's what,
Interpret that as even getting closer to who I am, because that's a question people ask themselves. I ask myself, yeah,
yes,
is this
yes,
me?
yeah. Absolutely. So therefore, study of Physis can be at, various layers you can go. You can ask myself, I can see myself as a psychological being, then I could think of who I am. Then I can go deeper and deeper and even see myself as a spiritual being, and still the question of who I am doesn't go. But all these are me. It's not that, me at the spiritual level doesn't negate me as a psychological being.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this what you see is the most significant part of Eric Burns' thought about Physis, which really brings about its true meaning. He says it's some force which drives people to grow, progress, and do better. So I know some people even ask this question, and some of my colleagues in my discussion, even the recent conference I attended, they were asking, does Physis always positive? If it's a life force, can it always not be better? I don't know. I think it's a matter of how you approach it. So at least from Burns' point of view, it is something which grows, progress, and does better. Okay, so we may regard this as a fourth force of personality besides the ego, superego, and the id. That's what he says. Okay, and this next sentence is something I love. Psychiatrists and psychologists know little or nothing about this fourth part. Religious people might say it was the soul. Scientists have no answer at present. So in other words, it's in a way it is undefinable, if you really look at it. But it helps to suppose that there is a system of tensions which normally pushes living things continually in the direction of progress. So this is how the whole thing is. How does the seed find its way up? Something is pushing it towards it. Okay, so therefore that is Physis. Towards progress, that is the important aspect he's talking about. It's not towards decline, it is towards progress. Okay, so we may suppose the existence of such a system in order to explain why people grow and why the human race tries to get better, and why animals gradually become more venturesome through evolution, and why a creative love of beauty is added to the mind as that energy system becomes more complicated from the jellyfish up through the frogs and monkeys to man. So it is so basic and fundamental, defining our own existence, even though it by itself cannot be defined. So we cannot forget the question of whose benefit this is for. His other hat comes in here, rational hat, and he says we cannot forget the question of whose benefit this is for, and still suppose that There is a force within us which keeps us striving to go onward and upward. So that is an important aspect which I strongly believe in, which is Physis is the force that pushes us to be better. In other words, it pushes us towards health, not just absence of illness.
We cannot forget or can forget. We
Which
can.
Yeah, we can forget the question of whose benefit this is for. Because
Yeah.
it is, if you start talking about, why is there Physis?
Sometimes there's no reason. That's
Yeah.
then why did you climb the mountain? Because it is there.
Yeah, absolutely. Why did God create men, sort of a thing? Why did the universe come into being? There's no point in doing it. There is a universe which exists, and I think it's almost that level. So because that's why it pushes us towards moving onward and upward and so on and so forth. And that's why I think even in he diagrammed it as the arrow coming from the child ego state and moving through the whole person and beyond.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so that is a long answer for your question.
What is Physis?
What is Physis?
Yeah. Really, but it's helping me connect with that idea of transcending,
Yes.
moving towards a higher version of self, which, and which is an energy that is present in all of us.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So in a way, somewhere at the core, it could be the source of okayness we are talking about. Like when we say I'm okay, you're okay. Fundamentally, it's saying, the Physis that is there in me is what is there in you as well.
Mm. Everyone has the capacity for growth.
Yes, absolutely.
And has an innate essence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody, factors why everybody is not growing. For example, some of the argument against it is there are some people who are oppressed, and yeah, definitely environmental factors. There are some who are innately disadvantaged in terms of what socio-political environment or socio-economic conditions in which we are born and so on and so forth. Yeah, that may, in a way, not allow the Physis to really manifest, and which may even seem like there is no Physis, there is no room for Physis. But I think the idea is that is what the environment is not allowing that Physis to manifest. So that is also something we need to acknowledge. There's no point in being simply blaming everybody for not coming, realizing their full potential. Because, for example, if a good seed is put on a rock, it's not going to grow. So we can't blame the seed for that. We can't say the seed does not have life, but it needs the conditions to grow as well.
Yeah. So that means contexts can snuff out Physis, but Physis exists.
Yeah.
Lovely. So what is your personal connection, Surya? I can sense it already, the strong connection. But I see you so passionately teaching this to people. What draws you to it?
See, it started actually with my study of Vedanta, which I've been doing since my mid-20s or whatever. Somehow it got drawn into that. And maybe that is part of my Physis, looking for something more than what I already have or whatever. And when I studied Vedanta, which is highly philosophical, all of us know. And by that time, I was also into TA. And at those time, I was, of course, working with organizations, not in psychotherapy. But even in organizations, we are using all the psychotherapy models and concepts of TA, extrapolating it in order to using it in organizations. Like, okay, what does the PAC of this organization look like? What are the contaminations in the organization? That was the main approach. So when I studied Vedanta, somehow it resonated a lot with our philosophy of okayness. And also the idea of, if you look at the dharma karma paradigm, it resonates with TA's fundamental philosophy that each of us choose our destiny. Okay. So it gave a highly, more of a high level spiritual dimension to life per se. But my struggle was to how to apply it and bring it to my work. Because applying a psychotherapy model in an organizational context, has its own limitations. Nowadays, we have several frameworks which has originated from the developmental fields. But in those days, I'm talking about 30 years back, not many that was available. So when I was looking for, those aspects of, how do we use TA more for a developmental perspective? Like Julie Hay coined that word developmental TA at some stage in the 90s. But again, it was more of the psychotherapy models translated into much more, relatable, useful ways and so on. So when I started looking more and more into it, that is when I stumbled upon Physis, the very little that Byrne has written. And of course, the whole article that was written by Petriska Clarkson. Her article is a more comprehensive in terms of what does Physis mean and what is Byrne's take on it, and then how it could be used, especially by psychotherapists. That was the emphasis. Again, her focus was on how psychotherapists can use it. So that was the idea. So when I studied Physis, then it really immediately struck me, and that is how Julie Hay adopted this Eric Byrne's ego state model along with the Physis into even the script matrix that we use, how to depict script from a developmental perspective.
So she was the one who, the Physis arrow is already there,
It's
right?
always there, but she used this model of ego state when she was developing the script matrix from a developmental perspective point of view.
Oh, okay. So her script matrix, the child is pushed up. Right? Yeah.
No, Julia's model does not have the child pushed up. It
Yeah.
still uses the child is always,
Pushed
below
down.
the parental figures.
Uh,
But she uses a Physis arrow, and the arrows from the parent, adult, and child do not enter directly into PAC or whatever.
yeah. And she says the child is choice making and she's
Yes.
that gap.
Yes.
She also draws Physis arrows for the parent figures, not just the
Yes.
child. Yeah,
Yes.
that everyone
Yes.
is doing their best.
Yes. So
That,
that
that
so
was
that emphasis, yeah, that was very interesting, and that helped me a lot to look at even script from a more positive point
yeah,
of
yeah,
which Fanita English, emphasized a lot.
yeah.
So that is what drew me more and more into, knowing Physis. So then once I got to know Physis, again, the challenge was how do we operationalize it?
Shall we talk about that? Maybe you've been talking about Fanita English's model. You want to share with us
Okay.
how shall we go forward in this? You want to talk about how to operationalize this?
Yeah, we can look into that. And
Yeah.
before that, I just want to emphasize on what Patricia Clarkson says about how to use,
Mm.
or what is the role of Physis, even when transactional analyst practitioners and so on. Because
Sure.
that's another very defining moment for me when I read the literature that gave me a clear conviction about, why we need to do more of this work.
Okay.
Otherwise, it sounded like more of a good, fascinating thought or idea.
Yeah.
But why is it relevant?
Yeah.
So this is what she says.
Yeah.
She says the task of psychotherapists and educators. She
Mm.
wrote it long back, and therefore these are the two fields she emphasized a lot. But I generalize it all transactional analysis.
Yeah.
Is to allow people to experience this life force within themselves
Mm.
in order to facilitate healing and self-realization. So
Mm.
she first talks about self-work,
Mm.
why everybody should do it, because we need to first have our Physis fully alive and available.
Mm.
For people to change, they first need to feel well and okay. That is in touch with their life force.
Mm. Mm.
So to kindle this is perhaps the most central and important of the therapist's tasks. That is to get people realize or touch the need to change. Because she says that itself is the first sign of Physis, in action. So without the experience of Physis, there is not the energy, the belief, or the capacity to even use help. We all know, many people struggle and suffer, but still they wouldn't seek help because somewhere, the physis is fully stifled. So it is just not available, it's almost like, a seed which is dumped in a sort of a dark room. It's not going to come out. So it doesn't mean it doesn't have that physis, but it's just not, conditions are not just suitable for it to really see light. So she says, this is the most powerful statement for me, actually. Thus, it may be both the first requirement in psychotherapy and the last.
Yeah.
Because many times we also realize when you're working with people, once we break through that inertia for change, and people say, yeah, I want to change, the conviction comes in, then it's only a matter of time. By the time, people find the ways and means and,
Yeah.
how to change and so on. So this is actually contextualizing physis in the practice itself. Why is it relevant?
Yeah. People showing up for psychotherapy is,
Yes.
is the manifestation of Physis.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so that's the first requirement. Yeah,
Yeah,
they have
yeah,
to have some hope that this will help them.
exactly.
Yeah, and that
And
they bring themselves into that space. Uh,
exactly. And sometimes, people come with lot of reluctance, lot of doubt and all that, but still there is some physis which is available. So much of the initial work works on, really removing those doubts, this, that, and then getting to a space of believing that, yeah, I can change. And then getting to a point of saying, yeah, I want to change, and then getting to the space of, okay, I will change. And now let me see how. So these are all various, I think, layers of physis, being released or whatever it is. So this is the most important aspect when it comes to practitioners, actually. So why physis is so relevant. And you asked about use of physis, right, in
yeah, yeah,
practice.
yeah.
So I look at it at three levels, Arna.
Yeah.
The first level is what we spoke about, more at a very high level, meta level, which is at a philosophical or spiritual level of what physis means and how it is and so on. But we need, really practical tools and ways in which to work with it, right? So that is the second level is more, we can find it more from the energy point, energy level. That's how I see it. Because energy is something you and I can experience.
Yeah.
Not only my energy, but I can also, in some sense, get a sense of your energy as well. So, in a transactional, in a social context, in a relational context, we often work with energy, right? So that is where I find, Fanita's the three forces drives model becomes a helpful way to work with
Okay.
Physis, where she talks about the three drives that we all have, Servia, Passia, and Transia. Okay. Servia is the drive to basically survive and sustain.
So this is whose model is this Serbia?
Vanita English is,
Oh, okay.
she writes about these three
Yeah.
models,
Yeah.
the drives that she
Yeah.
talks about. Again, drawn from the idea of, Greek mythology and all that. She uses the similar word, she coins these words. Servia is the drive to survive, to sustain. Because that is what our life force does, in spite of all whatever happens in our life, all of us survive, who survive. So that is the drive, which is basically to survive and sustain, fundamentally maintain the basic homeostasis. Okay, that is Serbia. That is also physis, one aspect of physis, if you really look at it. Then comes passia. Passia is the drive to be creative, to express, and so on. That in a way you can say it is that part which makes a species, really procreate and spread, and all that aspect which wants to, that is what passion. Or I may be interested in arts, or I may be really passionate about serving people, or whatever that we bring beyond basic survival. So that is passion, which again is what grows, leads to growth, leads to development. Okay, so that is exactly, again, as we know, it's part of the Physis. Because eventually that is how Physis, in my opinion, that is Physis in its full bloom. When I'm really expressive and I'm really creative and so on. And then she talks about the Transia, the third force, which is the force that leads to change, that pushes me. See, we may grow, express, and we may still be stagnating at some point. But there is something which pushes us to also change from maybe good to better and better to best, best, or, so as they say, good to great. So that drive that pushes us to change is, or, to flow with life, or, we talk about flow in terms of being engaged fully into something. So that is the energy which is transient. So these three are, I see them as, ways in which we could sense Physis in, action, being alive.
So you've made the connection, and I see this model, I immediately say, hey, yes, this is how Physis manifests itself. At the first level, to survive,
Yeah.
then to express, to be more, show the world who I am, what I'm meant for, and grow and become better and change and flow. I don't know. Flow is, I think, as Mihaly,
It's
flow.
not that flow. He doesn't use it in that sense. It is more like, again, flow that comes with
Yeah,
changing,
yeah, okay, yeah,
from
so
one state to the other.
adapting to the ups and downs of life.
Yes. More of developmental flow, flowing
Yeah,
from one state to another state, or moving from one stage to another stage. Yeah.
okay. So you see the connection between
Yeah.
our lives and Physis. Fantastic.
Yeah, this is the intuitive connection I found.
Yeah.
So this helps us to, even sense, which state I'm in. Is my Physis fully, bloom, or which part of my Physis is active right now? So therefore, which part needs to be, activated? We can look into all this. And we also know some of us have some parts of this very active at some stage or the other, or some part is always active some stage or the other, and so on and so forth. So which in a way, closely connected to this, again, the idea of Swadharma, if you really look at it. Dharma is, again, like in the Vedanta, we talk about how my dharma is connected to my nature, which is connected to the three gunas they talk about, Sattva, Raja, and Tamo gunas. So if you really look at it, the Sarvya, Pasya, Transia is almost closer to, it's not exactly, but closer to the Sattva, Tamas, Rajas, Tamas sort of a framework. So Sattva is the, what would I say, the flow, the chain, that sort of energy. Rajas is the Pasya, the creative, expressive part of it. And Surya, which is the tamas, it's just maintaining the status quo, whatever it is, and so on and so forth. So it's a very, what would I say, complementing frameworks. We really look at it. So it becomes more an operational aspect of Physis at a energy level. So that is the second level. Meta level is the spiritual or philosophical level, understanding. And at the energy level, which is more at a social, expressive level, transactional level, we can experience this.
Yeah.
Then comes at the third level, which is the operational level.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of, how do I use it in my work?
Yeah.
Okay, I understand this, but how do I help people change? How do I use it and make change sustainable? So that is the area which I really took a lot of time to understand, to grapple with, because if you really look at our transactional analysis frameworks, there is very little on that aspect.
How do I access this life-giving force and use it with others? How do I invite it in others? How do I recognize it? How do I invite it in also systems?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Exactly. Like for example, if you look at the idea of scripts, even though originally Byrne did not define it as being negative, he did say it is limiting. Okay. But all the examples and other things that he used eventually made people to believe that it's negative. We at least use it in that sense, right? When something is not okay, we say, oh, then you are in your script. You got into your script. When you are stuck, then you are in your script. As if other times I'm not in my script. Even the Fanita English talked about the, health or positive aspect of script. It is not the normal sense in which it was used. So when we take, and so naturally when you use that, say in an organizational context, or even in a, say, a coaching context or in an educational context, it can only help us so far. The immediate approach we take is, okay, what is wrong here? What is not working? What is the limiting belief? What is holding these people back? So we are trying to therefore find that and then trying to remove it, which doesn't ensure that will lead to health. So therefore we need an approach which looks at, okay, what is working here, what is going on, and what do I do, what is your nature, in other words, what is innate in you. So what do I do in order to be better, in order to develop to the next phase? So that is something which I really missed into working with people, clients, and that is when I got exposed to Dr. Monica Sharma's framework called, originally she was called it the conscious full spectrum approach to leadership. And now, of course, it is called radical transformational leadership framework, which is fundamentally a value-based framework.
Okay.
Which is, of course, we talk of value-based leadership and so on. So this is basically a practice-based model that was developed as part of the UN development programs and tested across various countries and cultures. And the framework helped to find how to build on the resources of people, the cultures, the societies, communities, and so on and so forth to push more of social projects, especially to bring in large-scale change projects. So fundamentally, it works with systems, not necessarily individuals. But even if you work with, you can use the model to work with individuals. But even with individuals, you look at the individual as a system, not just an individual in the sense of, it ends there sort of. It does not. It does look at it from a system point of view. So that framework helped, gave me really the first aha moment in terms of identifying, okay, now I know a way of working with Physis and inviting clients into their Physis.
Okay.
Because that is where, because the connection I make is at the operational level, how does Physis manifest? How do I know that I'm acting from my Physis? Because one thing that is common across definitions, Ethic Burn or others, is Physis always pushes us towards growth. Physis always, makes us toward, gets us to sustain. It's not to survive alone, but to sustain, to grow, to develop towards progress. Okay, in other words, it makes me better. So in other words, it is rooted in a consciousness. So, and how do we operationalize it at a psychological level? How do I know that I'm operating in a manner which is good for me or progressing and so on and so forth? So that is where the radical transformation leadership says, when my actions or choices are rooted in my core values, the universal values, then I'm acting from my resourceful state.
Okay.
Because when I'm acting from my values, I'm also creating a space for others to, manifest from their own values.
Okay.
Because values are something which is universal. We're talking about the core values, not the what you call as peripheral values. Okay, we're talking core values like say peace, happiness, harmony, or even full potential, dignity. Many of the values which is there as part of our own ITIA framework. You see that they are core values. They are actually universal values. So that is why they are adopted as principles to guide us to make ethical choices. So when my choices and actions are based or rooted in values, then my Physis is in play. Again, I know some people talk about values as, oh, that does it mean all values are positive? Aren't there negative values? Like, isn't an autocrat or a dictator is also working from their own values? That is a question that comes in actually. Some people ask. But in this approach, we are not looking at values from that sense. We are looking at values with an ethic framework. Which means, yeah, there are values which are life enhancing and life supporting values is what we are referring to, not the values which lead towards, sucking life out or that leads somebody away from progress. If it is leading to decline, then that is not what we refer as a value here. Okay, so we are talking of universal values, which is ever present, and it is again universal in the sense it is there with everybody. Which again connects to the okayness we are talking about. Whether I'm acting from a space of okayness, whether I'm attached with it, that is different. So many factors may stop me. But okayness is innate in all of us. Right? So that is the whole belief. So it is that value base is the foundation of this approach.
Okay.
Mhm.
So I think like we have a clear framework in ITA where the ethical principles are named and defined. I'm wondering how people recognize these universal core values. What? Yeah, so I can understand like dignity is a core, universal core value, or right to self-determination is a. But let me. So, is there a frame, or is it our own understanding of what universal core values are?
It's our own understanding of what is at the core of my being. Therefore, getting in touch with my core values.
Yeah.
I think that is the most emphasis in this
Okay.
way
Okay.
of work. We are not saying there is a
Okay.
list of universal core values
That
and
was
therefore you need to subscribe to it. No, because Physis manifest in different ways to different people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because an apple seed is going to only produce apples. You can't expect orange to grow from apples. But what produces both the apple and orange is the same life energy. So it is the same way, like you may strongly hold on to dignity as a value, core value, whereas I may strongly hold on to freedom as my core value. Okay? But when you make choices and decisions from a space of dignity, and when I make my decisions and choices from a phrase of freedom, both the choices and definitions are going to life and be and life enhancing. So they may vary in form and shape and specificities, but eventually the impact and the result will always be towards betterment. What Byrne says, things to be better and then the better to be more perfect. So that is the framework. The whole thing is,
So,
yeah.
I'm trying to see why you're saying this is a way that you understood how Physis can be manifested. And I'm going to offer an interpretation and you tell me. So, if I operate from a value base, then it means I've already invested in knowing what my values are and what's important to me. And I'm going closer to who I am
Yes.
and getting, so this is becoming more of who you are. Yeah. So, and finding your the core of your core your essence from which you can spring. Is that?
Yes, absolutely. That is the whole idea. And that itself is a lot of work, investment to get into understand what my core
Yeah.
value is. In other words, what do I really stand for?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
once somebody gets to that, then somehow it makes a lasting, it becomes sort of my own North Star,
Yeah.
especially in times of, confusion or uncertainty and so on.
Yeah.
Check if no other framework or models or analysis helps, this could help me to make choices. So that is exactly the, how I made this connection and found, therefore, the values are the closest or operational form of Physis. That is how I see values as. Values are operationalized Physis, if we were to use that term. So when I act from my values, then my Physis is more, free to manifest. It doesn't mean all of us would have understood and known and so on and so forth, because we all know very well that we act from a resourceful state, even without being totally aware of or able to articulate it. But when I'm able to consciously articulate it, then it becomes more powerful. So just quickly, maybe I can show you this diagram I put together based on Monica Sharma's work. So in
so you put this together?
Yeah, I put the thing together. It's an adapted version of it. Her original framework, the outer circle is where the values are, and then the inner world circle is the system, and then the solutions come into the innermost circle. Okay, because her belief is, values is the one where the connection takes place, sort of. So I turned the whole thing of inwards because for me somehow it makes a lot of sense that the core, since it is at the core, that is the self is in the core, so the values are somewhere in the core, which are supported by systems. And of course, eventually we reach out and connect with the world through those specific solutions to other problems that we are trying to solve and so on and so on. So therefore, Physis emerges from this space, at the value space. And as Physis emerges and we make choices, this is how development takes place. This is what Diane Salters also nowadays talks about.
Spiral dynamics.
Yes, the spiral dynamics of how, and we also know, Pamela Levin talks about cycles of development.
That's
Where
also
it's not going circle in the same circle, but every time we moving in a better space. So what leads to the development is fundamentally Physis, right? That we all agree. So where does Physis get that? How does it manifest? That is where the idea is. And our actions are rooted in the values or in the self. Then we find, we're acting from Physis, and that is when development really takes place. And it has to be aligned. Not only just values alone are not good enough. There have to be systems which really support and sustain those values. And of course, those has to be aligned with the specific actions that we are taking.
Those actions you're putting in the outer circle of
solutions, because that is actions is what eventually reaches out, and that is how we engage with the world. Right? People cannot have access to our values. They can't see it. And it's the solutions, real specific actions is what, engaging with the world. So therefore, we could say that these actions are rooted from our Physis.
So very interesting. So at the core is me and my values. I'm supported by the system and I act in ways to live my values. And that results in the spiral process of development. Yeah. And that is,
So this is what I call as integrative development. Where all the three levels, the development is integrative. Like the values, systems, and the solutions, actions are all aligned with each other. They're all integrated.
Okay. Lovely.
Yeah.
All right. I'm wondering how should we close this? Are we ready to move to a close or?
Yeah. Maybe one thing I would like to add to this is, for example,
if you have no more slides, maybe we can close this.
We can close the slides.
More clearly. Yeah.
For example, now we are talking about positive games.
Yeah.
You're aware of. So you could really see that what makes a game positive game. When it comes from a space of awareness. So in other words, when you say I'm aware and acting from awareness, it means I'm acting from a value base, right?
And the ulterior is a very strong reflection of a value.
Yeah, a value, an intent.
Yeah.
So my action outside may again look like all the patterns of a game.
Yeah.
But since it is coming from that space,
Yeah.
Eventually the impact is positive. So it becomes a lens through which we could, look at our frameworks and models, and it becomes a model by itself.
Yeah.
When you look at development.
Yeah. Maybe we can help our listeners understand this with an example. So a positive game will still follow the definition of a game, yeah, which is ulterior transactions leading to a well-defined, predictable outcome. But the ulterior transactions have a positive, like if I tell you, why don't you go ahead and take this risk? So the ulterior message is trust. I trust you, and that you will grow and learn from this process, and then you will also, and that's a predictable outcome. So so what is the connection you're making? If I were more aware of Physis, so
then my intent, the ulterior message is based on a value, a life enhancing value. In this, I'm not explicitly saying I trust you, you can do it and
or
stuff.
I feel that you have your innate power.
Yes.
So yeah. So it is a positive them. So what we are doing is helping people move towards their Physis. So what are we doing as individuals, groups, and organizations or systems to help people access their Physis?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's where the whole thing is. When I act from my Physis,
yeah,
then I'm inviting others also, or creating a space for others' Physis also to manifest.
Okay. I understand now why you are so energized by it. Yeah. I really hope more and more people deepen their understanding of Physis, and there's more writing and literature and experimentation with this idea. I think it will be wonderful.
Yeah, just now written a small paper for one of this New Zealand publications where last year I presented a workshop there.
Yeah.
So that is where I first written about this architecture for integrative development as a framework for Physis based work.
Yeah, yeah. Lovely. Yeah.
More experience, I think we can produce more.
Yeah.
And all the fields actually.
Yeah. I think it's relevant. It's not at all field specific.
Yes. Absolutely.
Thank you for your generosity once again. And so we'll share it, and we hope a lot of people access it. And and let this become a upward spiral.
Yeah.
Thank
you, Aruna. Thank you.
Excited and contributing. Yeah. Thank you so much, Surya. This was wonderful.
Most welcome. Thank you.